Conrad Thayer only meant to find a name and a phone number. The sketchbook had been left on the work table near the front window of his shop, half tucked under a velvet cloth someone had used to wrap a bracket clock. And when he opened the cover to look for contact information, his hands went still before he reached the first page. The drawing was in graphite, pencil on cream-colored paper, done in a style that was careful without being rigid. The kind of sketch that comes from someone who has looked at a face long enough to understand its structure rather than just its surface. It showed a boy of about 18, sitting at a workbench with a loop tilted back on his forehead and a watch movement held between two fingers, his attention fixed on something just outside the frame. The boy's jaw was Conrad's jaw. The particular angle of the shoulders was Conrad's. The hands were his hands. 25 years ago, when he had still believed that the things he built with them were the most permanent things in his life. He stood in the low afternoon light of the Thayer Restoration Workshop on Cleveland Street in Burlington, Vermont, holding a stranger's sketchbook, and the breath went out of him the way it does when something you had agreed to stop thinking about steps back into the room without knocking. The name inside the front cover was printed in the clean, deliberate hand of someone accustomed to losing things in busy places. Nadine Fairchild. Below it, a New York City address and a number with a 212 area code. Below that, in smaller letters, Fairchild Heritage Group. Conrad Thayer was 47 years old. He had spent the better part of 2 decades in this same building, which had been his grandfather's watch repair shop before it became his, restoring movements and cases and dials for clients ranging from private collectors to the Vermont State Museum. He had a secondary practice in forensic document authentication that had grown out of his understanding of paper and ink, and the way time degrades both, and estate lawyers and auction houses called him when a letter or a ledger needed to be read more carefully than its face value suggested. He was methodical by temperament. He was not easily surprised. He set the sketchbook down on the work table with the same deliberateness he used when handling a movement he didn't yet understand, and he looked at the drawing of himself at 18 for a long time before he closed the cover. He carried the book to the counter and called the number. It went to voicemail, a voice that was professionally composed and unhurried. And he left a message saying he had found the sketchbook and that she was welcome to collect it at the shop, or he could arrange a courier. Then he went back to the movement he had been cleaning before the velvet cloth, and the book and the drawing had reorganized the afternoon into something he would need time to put back in order. Nadine Fairchild walked into the shop 40 minutes later. She was dressed for a business meeting, which was because she had been in one. She was the kind of person who occupied a room without requiring everyone in it to acknowledge her arrival, and she moved directly to the work table where he had placed the sketchbook rather than waiting for him to retrieve it. When she picked it up and turned to face him, he saw the precise moment she recognized who he was. Her expression did not perform the recognition. It absorbed it. She went still in the way people go still when they are deciding how much of what they feel is safe to show, and then she said his name, his full name, Conrad Thayer, with the careful emphasis of someone who has said it silently many more times than aloud. He asked if she wanted to sit down. She said she had sent him 23 letters. He told her he had sent her 31. Neither of them had received a single one. To understand what that number did to both of them, it was necessary to go back to the winter of their senior year in high school. The winter a girl from New York City had arrived in Burlington because her father, Richard Fairchild, had temporarily relocated the regional office of Fairchild Heritage Group to oversee the acquisition of an estate collection too large to manage remotely. Nadine had enrolled at Burlington Central High in January with the particular self-containment of someone who had moved enough times to stop investing in the assumption that the next place would be permanent. She sat next to Conrad Thayer in AP Art History because it was the only available seat, and she stayed next to him because he was the only person in the room who talked about the work the same way she did. As if the objects on the slides had been made by people trying to solve a specific problem, rather than simply trying to be admired. They became friends through January and into February, the slow kind of friendship that builds in the margins of assigned seating and shared buses and the particular silence of a school library on a Wednesday afternoon. By March it was something more than friendship, though neither of them had the practiced vocabulary for what it was, because it was the first time for both of them, and the language for first things is always slightly too large or too small. Nadine's father had been good to Conrad in the way that a man of Richard Fairchild's position can be good to a young person he respects, while also being entirely clear that respect and permission are different things. His business partner, Elliot Hargrove, had been nothing in particular to Conrad at the time. A man in expensive shoes who attended the Fairchild dinners and watched him from across the table with the specific attention of someone who was not curious but was cataloging. In June, Richard Fairchild moved the office back to New York. The timeline was accelerated without announcement, and Nadine had 4 days of notice before the family left Burlington. She and Conrad had spent those 4 days very carefully, the way people spend time when they are aware it is finite and do not want to damage it by naming that. She had given him the address of the apartment on the Upper East Side. She had asked him to write. She had said she would write back. He had written every week through the summer. He had received nothing. In September, a letter arrived from a New York return address, in handwriting he recognized as Nadine's, which told him with a brevity he interpreted as kindness that she had moved on, that what they had shared had been a season-specific thing, and that she hoped he was well. He read it once. He filed it. He enrolled in his grandfather's restoration apprenticeship, built the career, built the business. He married Kathleen, who was a high school librarian with a precise understanding of what mattered to her and an equally precise understanding of how to make people feel seen. They had a daughter, Paige, who was now 17 and studying astrophysics and darkroom photography, with the focused intensity of someone who has already decided what she wants to do and is simply waiting for the appropriate moment to begin. Kathleen had died 3 years ago from a blood disease that had moved faster than anyone had expected, and the grief of that loss was real and specific, and not something Conrad spent energy framing in comparison to anything else. The letter from Nadine had been in his filing cabinet for 22 years. By the time Kathleen had arrived in his life, it had seemed like a document from a previous century, not worth mentioning, not worth revisiting. He had not thought to look at it again until he sat across from Nadine Fairchild in the 2 chairs he kept near the front window for clients who needed to wait while he completed an estimate. She told him about the letters she had written. She told him about that September. Sitting in the New York apartment, moving through what she had believed was as mutual silence, waiting for something that would explain it, and then receiving a letter from Vermont that had closed the question in terms she had understood as final. She described it without sentimentality, the way people describe things they have had a long time to understand. He got up and retrieved the letter from the cabinet in the back office. She read it standing by the window, holding it in both hands. When she finished, she said she had not written those sentences. They compared the handwriting. Her capital N, the particular way she had been taught to form it at 9 years old, the serif that curled slightly inward at the top, was present in the letter, but the motion was wrong. It was the difference between a signature that has been practiced until it is automatic and a signature that has been studied until it can be approximated. Conrad had spent 22 years learning to read exactly that kind of difference. He knew what he was looking at. He said he wanted documentation before any name was put to a conclusion. Converting private pain into public accusation without evidence was not something he was willing to do, and never had been. Nadine Fairchild had not married. She had spent the years after Burlington building what Richard Fairchild's company had always had the infrastructure to be: a serious institution rather than merely a prestigious one, and she had done it by becoming the person in the room who understood the objects most completely. That had required study her father's generation had considered unnecessary for someone who would eventually inherit the nameplate. She had an eye for forgeries developed over years of being wrong about things, and she was honest about this in a way Conrad recognized as the particular honesty of someone who had earned competence through failure rather than credential. She told him she had found him, years ago, through a professional directory. She had seen he was married with a child and had decided not to introduce disruption into a life that appeared complete. She offered this without framing it as noble. He heard it without argument, though something in the very cleanliness of that decision made the distance between them feel carefully maintained rather than naturally arrived at. She had come to Burlington because the Hargrove Fairchild estate collection was in the final stages of a contested authentication process, and two pieces in the collection carried flags her in-house team had not been able to resolve. Conrad's name was on a list of forensic document specialists. She had not known whose shop was on Clement Street until she was already checked into the hotel 2 blocks away. He asked if she thought that was a coincidence. She said she had stopped believing in convenient coincidences the same week. She stopped believing the silence from Vermont had been his choice. Elliot Hargrove arrived at the shop the following morning without an appointment. He was in his late 60s now, the expensive shoes replaced by shoes that were more expensive, and he came through the front door with the ease of someone long accustomed to spaces accommodating themselves to his arrival. He looked at the work table. He looked at the 2 chairs by the window. He looked at Conrad with the expression of a man doing a rapid calculation about what level of cordiality was currently strategic. He introduced himself, though no introduction was required, and said he understood Conrad had been engaged to consult on the estate authentication. He said he was confident the flagged pieces would resolve once the full provenance chain was reviewed, and that he had already arranged for the relevant documentation to be forwarded to Nadine's office. He said all of this while looking steadily at Conrad with the particular composure of someone making sure a message is received beneath the level of what is being said. Conrad said he looked forward to reviewing the documentation. Elliot left. By the time he reached the corner, he had made 2 calls. The estate collection at the center of the dispute was a grouping of 19th-century correspondence and personal effects from a Vermont industrialist whose family had donated the material to Fairchild Heritage Group as part of a planned auction benefiting a historical preservation fund. The collection had appraised at considerable value. A second appraisal, initiated by Elliot Hargrove on behalf of his advisory role to the estate's trustee, had come in at less than half that figure. The discrepancy rested on the authentication status of 3 letters. Letters that, if genuine, supported the historical attribution giving the collection its value, and that, if not genuine, reduced it to the status of an interesting accumulation of old paper. Conrad spent 2 days with the letters under magnification. The paper was correct for the period. The ink was correct. The fold patterns were consistent with letters that had been sealed and transported rather than aged artificially. But one of the counter-authentication reports, the one originating through a firm with a consulting relationship to Elliot Hargrove's advisory company, had made claims about the iron gall content of the ink that Conrad could not reproduce experimentally, claims that appeared to have been derived from a spectrographic analysis that did not match the instrument readings he was generating in real time. He brought this to Nadine directly. She listened with the concentrated stillness of someone who has spent decades training herself not to react before she understands. 3 days later, his consultation was formally contested. The challenge came through Elliot's legal team and characterized Conrad's engagement as a conflict of interest arising from his personal connection to the CEO. The filing named him by full name, referenced the Burlington Central High School attendance records, and was written with a precision that told Conrad the person behind it had begun their research well before the sketchbook was left on his work table. Conrad was asked to suspend his consultation pending an independent review of his methodology. He complied. He submitted every instrument reading, every calibration record, every chain of custody notation to the review panel in writing, and asked that the submission be timestamped and logged by the panel chair. Then he went home and told Paige that his name would probably appear in some coverage of a business dispute, and that none of it described anything he needed to be concerned about. Paige asked whether Nadine Fairchild was involved. He said she was the client. Paige said she had read about the collection online and that the counter-appraisal numbers seemed inconsistent with comparable sales from the same period. She was 17 and had spent enough time around authentication work to read an appraisal report the way most teenagers read a sports summary. He told her she was correct. She said, in the measured tone of someone who has formed an opinion and chosen to share only the factual component, that the firm behind the counter-appraisal had been involved in 2 other contested estate valuations in the previous 18 months, and that in both cases, the disputed collection had ultimately sold to a buyer represented by a holding company registered in Delaware. Conrad went to his filing cabinet. He pulled the letter from 1999 and looked at it under the loupe he used for movement work. He had authenticated signatures for 22 years. He had learned the trade from his grandfather and refined it through 300 cases. He had read the letter once in September of that year, folded it, and put it away, because reading it again had seemed like reopening something that needed to stay closed. He had not looked at it with professional eyes until now. The capital N at the beginning of Nadine's name as she had signed the letter was off by exactly the margin that careful copying produces. The inward curl at the top of the serif was present in the shape but absent in the pressure. The person who had made it had understood what Nadine's N looked like from the outside, and had reproduced its appearance without the muscle memory that produces the original. He made a photographic record of the letter under controlled lighting, then a second under ultraviolet. He sent both sets of images to a colleague in Boston who worked forensic document cases for federal courts and asked for an independent read, sending his own analysis separately so as not to influence the response. The response came back in 36 hours. His colleague used the word approximation and cited pressure differentials in the downstroke of 3 separate letters. The analysis was signed, dated, and formatted for submission as a professional declaration. Conrad's review panel returned its findings the same morning. His methodology was sound. His instrument records were consistent with accepted practice. The challenge to his engagement was dismissed. The panel noted, in language that was careful not to be inflammatory, that the counter-appraisal report contained a spectrographic claim that could not be reproduced using the cited instrument under the cited conditions. He called Nadine's office and left the panel results with her assistant. He called his Boston colleague and confirmed the declaration could be submitted to legal proceedings if necessary. Then he drove to the county archive, where a woman named Gretchen Adler had worked as a records specialist for 31 years and had, on 2 previous occasions, helped him trace the provenance chain of documents that had passed through Vermont estate offices during the 1990s. Gretchen was not surprised to see him. She had already been contacted by Nadine Fairchild's legal team and had been reviewing the relevant period files for a week. She had found something she'd been sitting with, waiting for the right moment to bring forward. Elliot Hargrove had served as executor for the Fairchild family's legal correspondence during the period when Richard Fairchild's Burlington office was operational. Under that authority, all personal mail addressed to family members had been routed through the executive office as a security protocol. A common practice, Gretchen explained, for families with active legal proceedings, which the Fairchilds had had at the time due to a partnership dispute unrelated to the Burlington relocation. Her records included a mail management log she had found in a box of transferred files from the dissolved Fairchild regional office. The log was handwritten and recorded, by date and origin, every piece of mail processed through the Burlington address during the relevant period. There were 23 entries from a Burlington Central return address spanning June through November of that year. Each had been logged as received, and each carried a disposition code. The code, Gretchen showed him the key, also present in the same box, translated to held, not forwarded. There were 31 entries from a New York City return address across the same window, carrying the same code. The final 2 entries in the log, one from each address, had a different notation: disposition, forwarded, outgoing substitute prepared. Gretchen said the phrase outgoing substitute appeared nowhere else in the standard log format. She had asked a colleague about it. They had agreed it did not mean what most people would assume a forwarding entry meant. Conrad asked her to make a certified copy of the log and retain the original in secure custody. She had already done both. He did not contact Nadine directly that evening. He called her chief legal officer, a woman named Louise Tran, who had been with Fairchild Heritage Group for 11 years and who had, in Conrad's previous professional dealings with the company, demonstrated the kind of attention that comes from taking seriously the difference between what is documentable and what is assumed. He gave Louise a summary of what he had found and told her that the personal dimension of the evidence was secondary to its legal function, and that he wanted every step of what came next handled by people whose standing in the matter was unambiguous. Louise said she understood. She would be in contact by the following morning. What Conrad did not yet know, because the legal team had not yet assembled the full picture, was that the Delaware holding company Page had identified was connected, through 2 layers of intermediary registration, to an acquisition vehicle Elliot Hargrove had been structuring for 14 months. The vehicle was designed to purchase the contested estate collection at the reduced valuation, resell it at a price reflecting its actual historical attribution, and distribute the margin to a small group of parties, of which Elliot was the primary beneficiary. The scheme required the counter-appraisal to hold. It required Conrad's engagement to be discredited, and it required Nadine Fairchild to be positioned as someone who had compromised her professional judgment in a way that gave her board grounds to question her oversight of the authentication process. The board met on a Thursday morning. Elliot Hargrove attended as a long-standing advisory member and presented what he described as a pattern of concern: the conflict of interest filing, the personal history, the nature of the sketchbook discovery, and, with the careful intonation of a man who has rehearsed the tone he wants, the fact that the CEO of a heritage authentication company had been carrying a pencil drawing of a man she claimed she had not contacted in 22 years. Nadine addressed the drawing directly. She said it was a personal object on her personal property, that it had no bearing on her professional judgment, and that anyone who wished to argue otherwise was welcome to specify the governance policy it violated. She was not going to account for the contents of her sketchbooks to a room full of people who had not once, in 14 years, asked Elliot Hargrove to account for the routing of correspondence through an executive office he had controlled. Louise Tran presented the mail log. She walked through each entry with the unhurried precision of someone who is not trying to persuade anyone but is simply ensuring the record is complete. Gretchen Adler testified by video call, speaking from the archive reading room where she had spent her working life. She described the box of transferred files, the log, the coding system, and the 2 entries with the non-standard disposition notation. She answered questions from the board's independent counsel with the composure of someone who has handled primary sources, long enough to know the difference between what a document says and what someone wishes it said. Conrad presented the forensic analysis of the 1999 letter. He had not been asked to attend the board meeting, but Nadine had requested his presence as a consulting expert, and Louise had confirmed his standing to appear in that capacity. He walked through the pressure differentials, the serif formation, the downstroke analysis, and the matching findings from his Boston colleague's independent review. He did not narrate the personal dimension of the document. He presented it as a forensic record. The board had sufficient context to understand what it represented. When Elliot suggested the mail log could have been altered, Louise produced the chain of custody record showing that the box had been transferred from the Burlington office directly to the county archive in 2004 under a retention order initiated by the State Historical Society and had remained in restricted access since that date. The box had not been opened until Gretchen Adler's review the previous week. When Elliot argued that the provenance of the Delaware holding company was irrelevant to the authentication question, Louise introduced the registration documents, the acquisition vehicle's formation date, and a communications record showing a series of exchanges between Elliot's personal email address and the holding company's registered agent during the 14 months preceding the contested appraisal. The board vote suspended Elliot Hargrove from his advisory role pending a full investigation. The investigation referred its initial findings to the Vermont Attorney General's office within 3 weeks. The estate collection was reappraised by a panel of 3 independent specialists whose conclusions were consistent with Conrad's original methodology, and the auction proceeded at a price that reflected what the collection had always been worth. Nadine retained her position and initiated a voluntary review of the company's conflict of interest protocols, not in response to the board's concerns, but because she understood that the conditions enabling Elliot's scheme had existed in part, because certain oversight structures had been treated as formalities, rather than functions. Richard Fairchild called Conrad directly. The call was brief and courteous, and entirely clear in its purpose. He acknowledged that his decision to route personal correspondence through the executive office had created the conditions under which someone else's specific ambition had operated, and he said this without mitigation, which Conrad understood as the most honest thing the older man could offer. He did not ask Conrad to do anything. He said he wanted him to know. Conrad said he appreciated the call. He said it had taken a measure of character to make it. Richard was quiet for a moment. Then he said that in his experience, the difference between a decision and a mistake was whether you acknowledged the consequences honestly, and that he was still working on being the kind of man who did not need a crisis to find that out. The days that followed moved at the pace of 2 people who have learned, through different routes, that moving quickly towards something important is a way of arriving before you are ready. They saw each other when the work brought them to the same location. They had several dinners that were not described as anything in particular, and both of them arrived having thought carefully about what they wanted to say. Paige met Nadine properly for the first time on a Saturday when she stopped by the shop to drop off a borrowed textbook. She did not perform a meeting. She asked Nadine what medium she preferred for the kind of sketching she did in her books, and Nadine said she had been using a 4H pencil for structural work for 20 years and had never found anything she preferred. Paige said that made sense for drafting from memory, where pressure needed to be controlled. Nadine looked at her with the expression of someone who has just been seen accurately, which is a different expression from being impressed. Later, Paige mentioned to her father with the careful casualness of a teenager who has already formed a settled opinion that his friend seemed like someone who paid attention to the same things he did. Conrad was in the back office when she said it, reassembling a pocket watch that had come to him from an estate in Stowe. He held the balance wheel in place with a peg while he reset the hairspring, and he did not respond immediately because the work required his hands to be still and his attention to be complete. He had gone through the archive box that Louise Tran's team had assembled, the mail log, the intercepted letters, the original bundle of sealed envelopes addressed in his 18-year-old handwriting to an Upper East Side apartment. He had not opened them. He and Nadine had agreed, without needing to discuss it at length, that the letters belonged to two people who had been trying to hold on to something with the uncomplicated certainty available before either of them had understood what certainty actually costs, and that opening them now would revise those two people in a direction neither version of them had asked for. He set the pocket watch down, cleaned his hands, and walked to the doorway. He told Paige that yes, Nadine paid attention to the same kinds of things he did, that it was one of the things that had been true about her from the beginning, and had, as far as he could tell, remained true through 22 years of being directed at everything except each other. Paige said that seemed like a significant thing to have in common. He said he thought so too. She asked if he was going to do anything about it, in the deliberate, non-leading tone of a 17-year-old who has already concluded the answer should be yes, and is leaving room for her parent to arrive at the same place independently. He said they were figuring things out. She said that was usually how it worked, and went upstairs to study. 2 weeks later, the Fairchild Heritage Auction opened at a venue in downtown Burlington. Nadine had moved the event from New York as a deliberate acknowledgement of where the collection had come from and what it had cost to protect. Conrad attended as a consulting specialist. He sat in the technical staff section during the opening session and watched the room fill with people who had come to see things correctly identified after a period of being misrepresented. And he found this satisfying in the way that work done right is satisfying, not because it was dramatic, but because it was accurate. After the session, Nadine found him near the display case where the 3 authenticated letters were mounted for viewing before the sale. She was carrying her sketchbook. She opened it to a page near the back and showed him what she had drawn in the week after their first conversation in the shop. It was the work table, the loop on its arm, the movement tools in their tray, a coffee mug he recognized as his, and 2 chairs by the window facing each other. He looked at it for a moment. He asked if she had anywhere to be after the auction closed. She said no. He said there was a place on Church Street that stayed open late and had a corner table where you could hear yourself think, and that he had been meaning to take someone there for a reason that had nothing to do with business for longer than he was going to try to calculate in front of a room full of people. She said she would need 20 minutes to finish the post-auction documentation. He said he had a watch to check, and that he could wait. They walked out together when the building closed, into the kind of Vermont evening in late spring that is cold enough to require a jacket and clear enough to see every star. Neither of them said anything for the first block, which felt less like silence and more like the particular quiet of 2 people who have been waiting a long time to simply be in the same place, without the thing they were waiting to resolve hanging between them. The sketchbook was under Nadine's arm. His first letter to her, the one that had never arrived, was still sealed in the archive box at Louise Tran's office, and his last letter to her, written in November of that year and never mailed, was still in the inside pocket of the jacket he had worn to the auction, the same jacket he had worn to the 2 dinners that were not described as anything, and which he had been meaning to return to the closet, but had not. He did not take it out. The things he had written at 18 were the right things for 18, The evening ahead of them was not a restoration project. It did not need to recover what had been taken. It only needed to be itself, which was already more than enough to begin with.